Let's be honest, leading right now isn't easy. We're all trying to keep up with the pace of change, but what happens when you turn up that dial and leave the corporate office to operate on the front lines of war zones and natural disasters? Hamish Wilson is a globally respected humanitarian and entrepreneur who uses his experience from South Sudan to Somalia to help leaders navigate complexity and change. He's earned honours such as the Queen's Medal for his work in Sierra Leone's Ebola crisis and the NATO Meritorious Medal for his service in Afghanistan. He's also co-founder of Impact's sister company Wasafiri, Africa's leading systems change agency. Today, he helps senior leaders across sectors from military commanders to corporate executives to thrive in volatile, fast-moving environments. As he reminds us in today's episode of In Good Company, leadership isn't just something you learn once, it's something you have to work on every day. I only wish this episode could have been longer. Let's join in with the conversation. Hamish, welcome. How are you?
Oh, I'm very good, Dan. Yeah, very nice to be seeing you. I'm all the way over here in Nairobi in Kenya.
Well, yes, I was just saying, just before we hit record on this, that we think that you might be our first ever guest that's joined us from an outside location. So before we get into that, let's, first of all, tell us about yourself. Introduce yourself in 60 seconds if you can.
Well, 60 seconds, I'll do my best. Well, I'm from a dusty little town in outback Australia. I grew up with absolutely no sense that one day I'd be living in Africa, working in war zones or natural disasters. And as a matter of fact, I started out in the corporate world for Accenture. Mm-hmm. But I think I had a real light bulb moment quite a long time ago during my first visit to Africa. And it was just after the genocide in Rwanda back in 94, which maybe you remember, or maybe you're too young, Dan, I don't know. But I found myself working in a refugee camp in Uganda at the time. And, you know, as you can imagine, it was eye-opening. And that definitely set me on this path. And now, as I said, I'm living here in Nairobi in Kenya. I spend most of my time helping organizations tackle really hard problems, which might include violent extremism in northern Kenya, for example, or food security for school students in Uganda, or helping poor communities adapt to climate change, these sort of things. And I think along the way, about 10, probably 15 years ago now, your impact, kindly helped us set up an organization to do this on a much bigger scale. And so we're an organization called Wasafiri, which is Swahili for travelers or explorers. And now, I'm proud to say, we've grown into Africa's leading systems change agency. And that's where I am now. And these days, what really drives me is helping leaders tackle complex problems.
Well, I'm fascinated to get tapping into that breadth of knowledge and experience that you've had from over the years. One thing that kind of, again, just before we hit record, and for the benefit of listeners, so Hamish is joining us from a co-working space, but is sat within touching distance of an electric fence. And I think that kind of, we were kind of talking about what that was keeping out, and it kind of gives an idea of what sort of environments you find yourself working in, doesn't it?
Yes, right. I don't want to give Nairobi a bad rap. It's a beautiful co-working space. You know, there are, risks here, and this particular electric fence, which is about right there, is more for security against people, I should say, rather than animals.
Yeah.
But if I do get shot, accidentally, you'll know why.
That's it. So if we suddenly see you needing some medical assistance, then we'll know what's going on.
Right.
So, yes. So in terms of to where you've got now, what was it specifically, or maybe there was a few different things. What was it that drew you into these kind of environments?
Yeah, I realise this is certainly not a typical career path. But if you cast your mind back, you can remember when the tsunami struck Southeast Asia, back in the day. I found myself working on part of the recovery operation, but I was, very green and wet behind the ears. And I can still remember standing on a mound of rubble during that occasion in a beautiful place called Coral Cape, Cowlack as it was known. And it was complete devastation. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. And I think that was certainly part of a whole series of wake-up moments that I've had along the way. I mean, Uganda was another, where I think I realized that I wanted to be part of working with people and communities affected by war, disaster, complex social environmental issues. And over time, that led me to work on humanitarian operations.
Mm-hmm.
For example, working with the UN in Pakistan after the earthquake, working in Myanmar after the cyclone Nargis. And that led me to work more and more on issues associated with war and conflict in
Right.
places like South Sudan and Somalia. And, I think one thing led to another, but I guess the thread wasn't so much about chasing war and disaster, it was more about people.
Mm-hmm.
And really, this fascination emerged of this question about how do you help people move forward when everything feels impossible. So I think they're some of the threads that pulled me to be where I am right now, next to an electric fence in Nairobi.
Well, yeah, and I think life is a constant journey, isn't it? And, and yours has certainly been a fascinating one, to say the least. Out of interest, that you were saying about you were working in in places like the natural disaster that happened in Southeast Asia some years ago. What capacity were you working in? What was it you were actually doing?
Well, that was actually part of an attempt by Impact to find a way to support the recovery operation. I mean, I think if you can remember, it was kind of all hands on deck. And I think when we think about the history of responses to humanitarian operations, it was part of a concerted effort, I think, by the private sector, the wider global private sector, to see how it can mobilize its resources. And Impact, I think, in their farsightedness, mobilized part of a team. And I found myself working with part of the Impact office from Thailand and around the region to find out how we could help mobilize a broader private sector response. But like I said, I was very new to these environments, very green and wet behind the ears, which is why I think I was just so awestruck by the devastation and the environment. And I think why, I became so receptive to this idea of, could I be more meaningfully working in this space?
And so, fast forwarding it to and going through your career, what was it that those early experiences taught you about leadership, and what do you sort of see? Do you see still being true, and do you see has maybe changed over the years?
Well, it's been quite a journey, and I think over the years I've seen lots of different forms of leadership. Lots of different types of people in different kinds of leadership roles, and I think probably the good, the bad, and the ugly for sure. And it's made me realize that we, certainly me, have had or have lots of preconceived ideas and notions about what leadership should look like. Oftentimes we default to this idea that leadership should be some sort of heroic or commanding or leading from the front kind of presence. But I think, if I'm honest, pretty much in all of the places that I've worked over the years, real leadership for me has actually tended to look very, very different.
Right.
And usually it's the people doing all the small, ordinary, hard things day in and day out. So if I think about Uganda and that refugee camp, the real hero for me was a lady called Esther, and she was a project manager. She wasn't, the big boss. She wasn't in charge. But you could tell that she had the ear of everybody. She had a sense of connection and a sense of real trust, and that people respected her. And I think over time, I've come to realize that leadership isn't about command and control. It is something else. It is something fundamentally human about helping people work better together. Making the tough choices, living with the consequences, and particularly when it gets tough and the stakes are high. So I think, these are some of the kind of insights that have really come to the forefront of my mind, just being in and out of these kind of environments over the years.
Yeah, and it's as you were talking there, it's and you'll know this as much as anybody, being so closely connected with Impact. But of course, Impact stands on leadership. Leadership isn't a person or a special, it's not a set of personality traits, but that it can and should come from anywhere. And you were saying that, that somebody without the job title of leader or manager necessarily was able to provide an act. So we're thinking of leadership as an action rather than as a special type of person. And so it sounds like that's something that you have both seen and also can. I suppose that's a question then: is how do you lead when everything is uncertain? You talked a lot about uncertainty over your career and being in conflict zones and so on. So there are times where you've led in situations with no rule book or perfect answers. So in terms of that then, and with the thinking around leadership being able to come from people that other than people with that particular job title, what does that leadership look like in reality in complex environments?
Yeah, I fully endorse this idea that everybody, or most people at least, have the capacity for leadership action. I think that is extreme. It's a liberating insight, I would say. But if I had to think of, somebody who comes across as a good leader and why, in my mind, I would be thinking about my old boss back in Somalia. He was the UK ambassador at the time, Matt Bohr. And at the time, it was an extraordinarily complex environment, as you can imagine. I mean, there were militias, there were terrorist groups, we had clans, international politics, African Union, peacekeeping operations, the works. And as you can appreciate, it's so hard to operate in these kind of environments. Things are constantly changing all the time. It's extremely foggy. It's hard to know who's who and what's happening. The stakes are high. It's extremely volatile. And yet you have to act. You have to decide. You have to move forward. And I think this was one of our superpowers, as an example. And look, I know there's lots of frameworks out there that help you understand why an environment can be so complex, like VUCA and Barney, and they have their place, but they don't actually help you decide what to actually do. And I think in these kind of VUCA environments, these kind of very, very volatile, complex environments, you can't control the fog. You can't control the uncertainty. So you have to decide how to move through it and who to move with. And I think this is where Impact's framework, your framework for leadership action, I think is extremely helpful. I think it helps people understand better how to notice and sense what's going on. I think it helps people understand better when and how to decide, how to learn and adapt, what to test and experiment with, how to move forward, and then rinse and repeat. Because with things moving constantly and in such a fluid environment, it really is a cycle of what next, how do I move forward? And if I had to go a little bit deeper, though, I would say that the heart of the work underpinning that as a leader is about how you work with others and how you're answering questions like, how do you build trust and connection with the people around you? How do you create that shared sense of alignment and direction? How do you help people learn and adapt and then adjust and pivot and shift, particularly when things are changing, often with little notice? And so for me, this is some of the hard work, I think, of good leadership in very complex environments.
It's there are some key skills that you've picked up on there that I think is it's something that doesn't necessarily come natural to a lot of people. Even with the leadership model you talked about there, with notice, decide, and act. And we'll come back to those sort of human soft skills in a second. But like one thing I've heard a lot of is that there's lots of people that are good at decisiveness and action. Lots of people that comes very easily to a lot of people, but the noticing piece, where it all sort of begins and comes back to, is something that I think it can. I heard a lot on a program I was on recently, and there was a keynote speaker saying that's the thing that you need to work on the most, because that's the thing that influences the next two parts, because that's the note, and particularly when you reflect on it and come back to it, that noticing piece is so critical to good acts of leadership. Not to say that the other two aren't, of course, but that noticing piece, I think if you crack that, then the other two will come a lot easier. I just wanted to talk about those that we've talked on something there about leadership being innately human and fundamentally human, and you also briefly touched on those soft skills, curiosity being one. I think empathy is a big one that we're hearing a lot more of at the moment. What other sort of human sort of soft skills do you think need to be really focused on to help, as we say, lead in these complex environments?
Yeah, it's so often overlooked, isn't it? Just to follow your theme, I think we can get obsessed with strategies and big pictures and plans and planning processes. We can get caught up in the technological revolution, AI and the like, and all of these things are fundamentally important. But I do think that we can often overlook how human the craft is of leadership. It is fundamentally about how you show up and how you connect with other people. Or to expand on that, fundamentally about how you serve other people. And I do think that we often tend to think that leadership is about us and who I am, what my agenda is, what I want to do. And I think if we regard leadership or our role as leaders in that capacity, we've missed something significant. We've possibly missed the point. I think it's fundamentally about elevating the people around us and helping to create a situation in which people can move forward together. And as I said, that is a fundamental human endeavor, which is the craft of leadership at its heart. Is how I would respond to your question.
And it always makes, whenever people say things like that, it reminds me of the sort of the 3-word slogan that's above my left shoulder here, which again is that Impact's tagline is liberating human potential. And it's exactly what you've just said. It's the developing people is what we do, and that enables other leaders to lead and develop other people as well. So, yeah, it has that reverberation throughout a knock-on effect. I wanted to kind of flip the conversation here slightly and ask you to tell us about a moment that maybe tested you. And that, can you share a time when either you made a mistake or nearly did, and those experiences? What did you learn from it or them?
Well, there's been plenty of those along the way. some rich territory, Dan, to mine. Yeah. Well, I can give you an example off the top of my head from Darfur, actually, in Sudan back in the days. I was working for a medical relief organization called Merlin, which no longer exists. And we were down in the southwest, which was a pretty remote, very insecure area. A lot of electric fences, as you can imagine, if they were working.
I can imagine, yeah.
And I was pretty new into this role. I was an area coordinator, so running a team and an operation providing medical care for communities affected by the fighting in the area. But I think pretty early on, I can remember, for one reason or another, just completely ignoring a warning about the security situation, which was deteriorating. And then, one thing led to another, and I found myself getting pinned down in a gunfight on the back of a donkey cart, which, even as I say these words, I realize how ridiculous that sounds. Yeah. But, at the time, it really shook me up. It was a profoundly humbling experience, and it was something that I created through my own ignorance and hubris at the time. So a profound kind of lesson at the moment. Or, I think about another moment when I was working in Myanmar after the cyclone, for example, with Save the Children, the big NGO.
Yeah.
I was totally maxed out. I completely burned out in that operation. I got caught up with the intensity and the craziness of the recovery operation. And I can remember a moment where I took a look at myself in the mirror. And it was a bit of a confronting moment. I really didn't like what I saw, and I realized that I was in too deep.
Right.
And if I step back from those moments, I realized that leadership is so hard on the ego. If that's important to you, is brutal. And in complex environments, leadership in complex environments particularly makes it even tougher, by definition. But in a way, that's a gift. And you have to look at it as a gift because it forces you to confront yourself. It forces you to take a long, hard look at yourself. And so for me, I think the question isn't so much about whether or not you're going to make mistakes, because of course you're going
Yeah.
to. But the real question is, well, what do you learn, and how do you carry that learning forward with integrity in ways that strengthen your leadership going forward? So, well, there's just a couple of little minor mishaps, you know.
Well, and it's I think acknowledging, and yeah, first of all, the I think that's a really strong culturally for an organization to embrace mistakes and rather than to put people down for them. Impact's one of those places that mistakes are as human as the humans that are working for organizations. So sometimes things happen and things don't go the way they would initially planned, and there could be many reasons as to why that is. But if you kind of see it as a learning opportunity rather than as a mistake and put people down for it, then you've got a lot more going for you then, haven't you?
Yeah.
And what so you talked about what was it that changed after that then, after you kind of looked in the mirror and thought, what have you done since to sort of stop that from happening again, or to what have been those learnings and what have been the changes that you've made?
Yeah, I would say there's been a couple of shifts on two different levels. I think on a personal level, part of the work is to be a bit more forgiving of yourself. And I think part of the challenge that I've had in various leadership positions is that you can be so tough on yourself that you can be relentlessly unforgiving, which means that you can be a little bit closer to burning yourself out. But I think as well, if it can lead you into a bit of a spiral where you can project that outward, and you can be overly tough and overly demanding and overly unforgiving on the people around you, perhaps even subconsciously without you even knowing it. And I think that can have a deeply undermining effect on the fabric of the team and the relationships within the team. Essentially it sends out precisely the wrong signals for those that you really want to be emanating, which is a culture of, it's more than just forgiveness, which is more of a kind of reactive thing, but more of a culture of like, we're in this together, shared learning, we are doing this together, and we've got one another's backs. So I would like to think, you'd probably have to ask my colleagues, but I'd like to think that I've got to be gotten a bit better at that kind of discipline, or that practice of recognizing the flaws and the failings and the frailties of all of us as humans in whatever position that we're in. And for that to be more of the basis for the way that we come together as a team.
And do you have any particular sort of techniques or mantras or whatever that keeps you grounded in those moments when things get tough? Or is there anything that particularly anchors you that you keep coming back to?
Well, if I follow that thread through, I mean, there have been some pretty tough moments along the way, and I think it's not so much a mantra as such, but it is, I think, drawing from some of the hard-hitting moments, hard-hitting experiences that perhaps help, or they don't help you, but they create a bit of scar tissue over time. It's learning from those tough experiences. I think about an experience back in Afghanistan where a colleague of mine was killed by the Taliban. It was
Right.
it was a suicide attack on the base that we all got caught up into. I mean, as you can imagine, completely brutal, totally horrendous. Something that to this day stays with me. And in a situation like that, of course, you can't just walk away. There is no time to fall apart. You can't just get on a plane and head to Dubai. You've got to keep moving forward. And I think what helped us through that moment collectively, there was a large team of civilians and military. There was a hybrid team of internationals and Afghan. But I'd have to say that this culture of real trust and connection, belonging and belief was fundamental to helping us be able to take those hard steps to move forward. And so I'm left from moments like that with the scar tissue that kind of creates with questions that I think are really much more at the forefront of my mind around how are you building a culture where people can say, well, I've got you, it's okay. I've
Yeah.
got your back. Or, where somebody can feel safe to step up, to speak up and ask for help, to reach out and grab that other person by the hand and say, hey, look, I need your help with this thing. And I think, in my view, that's the kind of spirit or culture or resilience that really counts, not just in these kind of acute moments that are incredible and horrendous and dramatic like this, but also in the moments that just continue to perpetuate and persist. When it's really tough, when it's really uncertain, when it's really hard over time, these kind of approaches for me are forefront of my mind about how we all move through this together.
I really like what you said there about trust, and trust is a crucial thing, I would think, to help lead through leading through complex times. What would be a good sort of starting point, a number one top tip for helping to build trust within an organization?
Yeah, that's
it's the $1 million question, right?
It really is. It really is. I mean, I think that leadership, if I really connect with a sort of a real core belief that I have about leadership, it is about how you show up for others. And I think the process or the practice of deliberately setting about to strengthen the trust that you have in the team or with the people that you have around you requires really deliberate efforts, I think, to reach out and go beyond perhaps your comfort zone, your inner circle, which isn't something I take for granted. I think we naturally gravitate from a kind of relational perspective to our comfort zones. And I think about an example that I think I'm constantly reminded of. And again, it's back in Darfur some years ago. And I sat down and in the dirt around a campfire with a group of guards. These were the guys who were guarding our compound.
Yeah.
And one evening they prepared a fire and they asked me to come and sit down with them. And they had this little high chair. And I said, no, I sat in the dirt and listened just to these guys. And you've got to bear in mind that in Sudan, if you're a guard, you tend to be the kind of people that most others wouldn't necessarily give the time of day for. I mean, that's just kind of how it was. They wouldn't really be the people that you'd be sitting down with or listening to. And anyway, I remember sitting down at the campfire with these guys, and we talked into the night, had endless cups of tea. And eventually, as we all got up to leave, one of them came up and he said, thank you. Nobody's ever sat with us before. And it was a bit of a mind-blowing moment, because I think it dawned on me that this is probably the first time some big boss, if you will, had probably taken the time to sit with these guys in the dirt and just listen to them. And in a moment like that, I think it makes me realize that leadership is about how you show up and how you make the effort, how you connect with others. And I'm sure that for everybody listening on the podcast, the kind of day-to-day battles and challenges look very, very different. But I do think the work of leadership, the work of building trust, as you say, is the same. It is about being real and authentic. It's about making the effort to go a bit beyond your comfort zone to help kind of create an environment where people do feel seen and they feel heard and they feel believed in and they feel empowered to step up. So how are you serving them? What are you doing in order to inculcate that kind of an environment?
Yeah. For some reason, whilst you were talking there, it reminded me of a reality TV show that was made in the States. I think it may have been made in the UK as well. But I think it was called Undercover Boss, something like that, where, they'd like disguise the CEOs of organizations and put them on their, and they'd kind of film their, they would be masquerading as a new employee and finding out what it's like on the front line, as it were, of an organization. And obviously the idea was that the people that they were being shown around by and shown the ropes by weren't in on it, and that they wouldn't know who this person was. Certainly not knowing that it was the CEO of the organization. It was it's reality TV, right? So it's made with a certain storyline in mind. But there's got to be something even out of that process that enables quite a lot of learning for the CEO or the leader. So it's almost taking that approach, as much of it as it was made for a TV show and a bit of a gimmick. But there's got to be some real learning in that process. And maybe just taking the idea of that, or not even having to go undercover, of course, but actually as a CEO or somebody within a C-suite of an organization, going and finding out about the people that work for you, and getting to know them on a really human level. There's got to be power and in that process.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. I think that'd be fascinating. I do think it's a real sort of acid test of any kind of organizational culture is, or frankly, any kind of a test of a leader or somebody in a position of responsibility is, what are people actually saying about you or the organization behind your back? But you will never hear because you're never there, unless you're the undercover agent. But I do think that's always a bit of a litmus test. So what are you assuming? Right now, so our team are out in the garden, and in fact, I could just hear them all laughing away. And I just
because they're talking about you. Is that what you think?
Yeah, but it was just, it was lovely. I was working away on a report, something fairly dull, but it was so lovely just to hear the kind of the sounds of that for me indicated, okay, we've got a really positive vibe. We've got some lovely relationships in the team here. There's a team that are coming together, and these kind of little signals, I think, are really telling about the nature of the culture, for better and for worse, frankly. So that was a lovely little moment.
And absolutely, and we've talked a lot about leadership being fundamentally human. What, in terms of now, especially with rapid technological advances, what does that mean for leaders today? What would you say that you would want leaders to remember most from this conversation, particularly with the rapid change that we're experiencing? Another big question for you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, wow, you're laying it on the. Perhaps I've reiterated this or mentioned it earlier. I think complex environments are extraordinary tests of leadership. They're extraordinary tests of leaders, by definition, right? Because they're the toughest environments for us all to be operating in. And I think I'm deeply sympathetic to people that find themselves in positions of responsibility where the options or the choices aren't necessarily clear. The pros and the cons are really messy. There may be no good choices, and you're inundated with all manner of questions and dilemmas and contradictions, where it's not a binary, simple yes, no, right, wrong kind of situation. So I'm deeply sympathetic of what that means, what that looks like, what that feels like. And I think there can be a tendency perhaps to forget that fundamentally underlying that, you sit in a special place within an ecosystem, and that ecosystem comprises lots of other people in varying degrees of privilege and power and relational authority or not. But that fundamentally, if you are not able to achieve anything without that ecosystem being able to move forward in a direction. So despite all of the challenges and the dilemmas and all of the assault on your inbox and the to-do list and the meetings, the endless demands, etc., on your time, it can be all too easy to forget that you sit at the heart of an ecosystem or a community of people, and that your principal job is serving that ecosystem to be able to move forward together in a degree of harmony, in a degree of alignment, for a degree of a shared purpose and a shared goal. So I think this is fundamentally what leadership is really all about. And we it's all too easy to forget it in this day and age. So yeah, perhaps reiterating some of the points in a different way I was making earlier.
Yeah, no, well, that is what it comes back to, isn't it? Is that there is some. I think what's interesting is that there is some simplicity in how we lead, in the sense that a lot of the skills that we've talked about, in my opinion, are they are human skills. Humans are social animals. It's just drawing that out in the right context. I think that's where it gets a bit more tricky, and particularly when we're faced with the ongoing pressures and there are obviously certain circumstances where you can't just go for a beer or whatever and hash the world out and put the world to rights. But there are we're probably better at some of the leadership skills that we've talked about than we maybe give ourselves credit for or space for. And like you say, we get so caught up in process and strategy that we don't necessarily give time to those areas. And feel free to counter me on any of that I've just said. But it feels like, once we've explored those human traits that we are probably innate in all of us in some capacity, and start to develop those, that's where leadership can start to shine out a bit more. Would you agree or disagree? Anything of that?
Well, just a thought was emerging just as you were talking, which is that I do think there's I mentioned one of the tests of leadership earlier being around, well, what are people saying behind your back, or what does the culture really look and feel like behind your back? And I think another test of leadership is, to what extent are you helping to elevate the leadership of others? And in a funny kind of way, that most likely means you stepping away, or you exercising your leadership in a way that allows you to step back from the wielding of your power in order to share and to distribute and to intentionally give that power to others so that they can step up. I mean, I go back to this idea. In fact, you interviewed a colleague of mine, Dr. Kate Simpson.
That's right.
And she talked about leadership for systems change. She talked about systems leadership. I think fundamental to leadership for systems change, or shifting a system, is this recognition that any kind of hard challenge has to be shifted through a collective movement, through a collective action. And so that's recognizing that if you're in a position of leadership or responsibility, then how are you thinking through the process of letting go of your power and handing your power over in order to mobilize the energies and the efforts and the intelligence of others around you? So I do think that's another critical litmus test of your leadership. So over time, perhaps the more effective leader that you are, the more likely you are to be stepping back in your leadership, if that makes sense.
It's been a fascinating conversation, Hamish. Sadly, we're running out of time, so I will leave you with one final question, and then I'll let you get back to your day. But first of all, thank you for a great conversation with me today. I really appreciate it. My final question to you is the same question we ask all of our guests, which is a bit of a sort of self-reflection exercise, which is that if you were to look back on your colourful career, let's call it, what would be, if any, the best piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
Well, we'd be going back in time now. That's one thing. What comes to my mind, I think, is a question that I was asked by a line manager at the time. And I remember him asking me, and this was probably after some sort of minor misdemeanor or mishap, I can't quite remember, but I do remember him asking me, he said, look, let's be honest, Hamish, why would anyone want to be led by you? And that's such a brilliant question. It's such a hard question. I still ask myself that. And I would definitely be asking that of my even younger self as I was starting out on my journey to even try to get a sense of what responsibility or influence or leadership even looked like or meant. And I think it reinforces this idea that leadership, it isn't just a static thing. It's not just earned once. You have to earn it again and again and again in every meeting, in every moment, in every decision that you make. And I do think the best leaders I know are the ones that are still asking these kind of hard questions. And for me, I think that's what authentic leadership is all about. It's continuing to ask the hard questions of yourself It's continuing on that journey, that practice of continual self-reflection, because I think that is the basis of improving and strengthening the way that you lead in the world. So there we are.
What a great answer, and what a great way to finish. And it is an excellent question. It's one I've heard before, and we asked that question as well. And it's it really does stop you in your tracks and get you to really question yourself and really look at yourself and go back to that leadership model that we talked about earlier, that gives you an opportunity to notice, to decide that you might want to make some changes, and then of course you can start to make those actions, reflect on the whole process again, and keep the whole process going. So it's a brilliant answer, and again, it's been a wonderful conversation, and I thank you for your time, and well done for getting through the whole conversation without electrocuting yourself on the fence to your right. So thank you ever so much, and I look forward to the next time we can chat again. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, mate.
Thank you. Which leaves me to say that if you'd like to find out any more about the work that either Impact does or Wasafiri does with Hamish, then you'll find all of the links that you need in the description of where you found today's episode. So thank you once final time to Hamish for joining me today on In Good Company. Thank you, Hamish.
Thanks, Dan. A real pleasure.
And until the next time, take care.